On June 11th, 2026, hundreds of Arch Linux users built a package they had used for years. And in the background, a Rust binary quietly harvested their credentials. It took their SSH keys, GitHub tokens, browser sessions, and cloud credentials. No exploit, no zero-day, no warning. The package looked exactly the same as it always had. The name was right, the version history was intact, the trust was real. Only the build instructions had changed. This is the Atomic Arch supply chain attack, and it is the most significant security event to hit the Arch Linux community in years. More than 400 packages were compromised. A second wave followed. The affected list is still not complete. Now here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. The attackers did not break into Arch's systems. They did not find the vulnerability in Pacman or in the AUR infrastructure itself. What they did was far more patient and far more clever. They exploited something that is generally hard to fix, the way trust is inherited in an open source ecosystem. And that raises a question I want you to keep in mind. If the AUR's trust model is fundamentally broken, what does that mean for every other repository? What does it mean for NPM, PYPI, Homebrew, and the AUR's spiritual cousins? Because the answer is not reassuring. In this video, we are going to break down exactly what happened, how the malware actually works, and who is affected. We'll look at what you need to do right now if you are an Arch user, and what this means for the broader Linux ecosystem. I've been a systems administrator for over 25 years, and I want to give you the Sysadmin's perspective on this. Not just the security researcher's write-up, but the practical, operational reality of what you do when something like this lands on your network. Let's start with what the AUR actually is and why this attack was possible in the first place. Chapter 2 of 12, the AUR's trust problem. If you are not an Arch user, here is the quick version. Arch Linux has two tiers of packages. The official repositories, core, extra, and community are maintained by Arch's trusted users and developers. Packages go through review before they land there. They are signed, they are audited. When you install from the official repos, you are getting something that has been vetted. But the AUR is different. The Arch user repository is a community-driven collection of build scripts called PKG-BUILDs that anyone can submit. These scripts tell your system how to download source code. They tell it how to compile it and install it. The AUR is not a binary repository. It is a recipe book, and the recipes are written by volunteers. They are not written by Arch's core team. That is enormously powerful. The AUR contains tens of thousands of packages that are not in the official repos. Niche tools, proprietary software wrappers, development builds, things that are too obscure or too licensing complicated for the official repos to carry. It is one of the reasons Arch users are so loyal to the platform. The software selection is unmatched. But here's the catch. When you build an AUR package, that PKG-BUILD script runs on your machine with your permissions during the build process. If the script contains malicious instructions, those instructions execute. There is no sandbox, there is no signature verification on the PKG-BUILD itself. The trust model is simple. You trust the person who wrote the script. And here is where the vulnerability lives. The AUR has a feature called package adoption. If a maintainer abandons a package, stops responding, goes inactive, or explicitly orphans it, another user can request to adopt it. They inherit the package name, the version history, the star ratings, and the comment threads. All the social proof that makes a package look trustworthy. They get all of that, and all they had to do was ask. The Atomic Arch attackers understood this perfectly. They did not try to create new packages and hope people would install them. That is typo squatting. It is noisy, it is obvious, and it has a low hit rate. Instead, they went hunting for abandoned packages that already had users. Packages that had been around for years. Packages that AUR helpers like Ye or Paru would happily auto-update without a second thought. They adopted those packages. And then they waited for users to run their next system update. Now the AUR does have a warning system. When you use an AUR helper, it is supposed to show you the diff of any changed PKG-BUILD before building. And technically, you are supposed to read it. But let's be honest about how most people actually use the AUR in practice. That gap between the intended workflow and the real-world workflow is exactly what these attackers exploited. Let me walk you through the mechanics of this attack, because the technical execution is genuinely clever. And understanding it is the only way to defend against the next version of it. Step 1. The attackers identified orphaned AUR packages. These are packages whose original maintainers had walked away, stopped maintaining them, or stopped responding to bug reports. They specifically targeted packages that were explicitly marked as orphaned in the AUR system. The AUR has thousands of these. Some are obscure tools, but some were once widely used. The attackers targeted packages with existing users and a history of legitimate use. They filed adoption requests to the normal AUR process and the system approved them. Step 2. They modified the build scripts. Not the package itself, the pkg, build, or the .install hook. They added a single line, npm install atomic-log file. That is it, one line. And they spoofed the git commit metadata to make it look like the change came from a long-standing maintainer. An account that was later confirmed was never actually compromised. The attackers just forged the commit author. Step 3. Users ran their normal system updates. An AUR helper like Yay or Paru fetches the update. It runs the build, and as part of the process, npm install atomic-log file executes. That pulls down the malicious npm package. It contains a pre-install hook that runs automatically. That hook extracts and executes a bundled Linux binary called deps. The deps binary is the actual payload. It is written in Rust, it is not a script. It is a compiled binary, which makes it harder to inspect. And it starts working immediately. Now here's the detail that makes this attack dangerous. Atomic log file was listed alongside two legitimate packages. The malicious one was camouflaged. If you glanced at the output, you would see 3 packages being installed. 2 are fine. One is stealing your credentials. Nothing about the output screams malware. A second wave followed within days, using a different package name, js-digest, pushed from separate accounts that the community linked to the same npm publisher. Different binary, different hash, same objective. They had a backup plan already in motion. That is the level of operational sophistication we are dealing with here. This was not a script kiddie. This was a coordinated campaign with fallback infrastructure. Chapter 4 of 12. What the malware actually steals. The deps binary, the Rust credential stealer at the heart of this attack, was reverse engineered by an independent researcher named Wanos. And the target list is not random. This malware was specifically designed for developer workstations and build systems. Whoever wrote this understands exactly what kind of machine an Arch Linux user is likely to be running. Here is what it collects. Cookies, tokens, and local storage from every Chromium-based browser on the system. Chrome, Edge, Brave, Vivaldi, all of them. Session data from Electron applications, Slack, Discord, Microsoft Teams. GitHub tokens, npm authentication tokens, HashiCorp Vault tokens, OpenAI and ChatGPT bearer tokens and account metadata, SSH keys and known host files. Shell history, Docker and Podman credentials, VPN profiles. Think about what that combination of data actually means in practice. If an attacker has your GitHub token, they have access to every private repository you can reach, including any CI/CD secrets stored in those repositories. If they have your SSH keys, they can authenticate to every server you have ever connected to. If they have your vault tokens, they potentially have access to your organization's entire secrets management system. If they have your Docker credentials, they can push malicious images to your private registry. This is not a consumer credential stealer going after your Netflix password. This is a targeted attack against the exact assets that give access to production infrastructure. One compromised developer laptop can be the entry point to an entire organization's cloud environment. The stolen data is exfiltrated over HTTP to temp.sh, a legitimate file sharing service, which means the outbound traffic does not immediately look suspicious. Command and control runs through a Tor onion service via a local loopback proxy. The malware is designed to blend in. For persistence, it installs a systemd service with restart equals always. If you're running as a normal user, it creates a per user systemd unit under ~/.config/systemd/user/. If it ran as root, it writes a system level unit under /etc/systemd/system/ and copies itself under /var/lib/. Either way, it wants to survive reboot. Now, the eBPF rootkit component. Early write-ups overstated this, so let me be precise. The rootkit is optional. It only activates when the binary already has root privileges and the right Linux capability. It is not used to gain root, it requires root to already be present. What it does when it activates is hide the malware's own processes, process names, and socket connections from standard system tools. It uses pinned BPF maps with names like hidden PIDs, hidden names, and hidden inodes. It also kills any attempt to attach a debugger to the malware process. That changes the cleanup calculus significantly. If the malware ran as root on your system, removing the AUR package is not enough. A package manager can only remove the files it knows about. It cannot verify that a rootkit capable payload has not left additional persistence mechanisms that are now hidden from the tools you would use to find them. There's also a second binary tied to the Monero wallet GUI package that researchers flagged as a possible crypto miner. It has not been fully analyzed yet. An eBPF rootkit bolted onto a credential stealer with a possible crypto miner component is not a typical piece of commodity malware. This is why the security community is taking this seriously. Let me be clear about the scope here, because the initial coverage created some confusion. The AUR is an Arch Linux specific ecosystem. The official Arch repositories were not touched. This attack only affects users who installed packages from the AUR and specifically packages that were compromised. Specifically, packages compromised between approximately June 11th and when the malicious commits were cleaned up. If you are running Arch Linux and you use the AUR and you updated recently, you need to check your system. Arch-based distributions are also in scope if their users install AUR packages. EndeavourOS, Manjaro, and CachyOS users are affected. Notably, the CachyOS forums were one of the first places to document the scope of this attack. What about WSL2? Yes, Windows developers running Arch under WSL2 and installing AUR packages are affected. The WSL2 environment is isolated from the Windows host, but the malware targets files within the Linux environment. Those files include tokens and keys that are also used from Windows, treated as potentially compromised. Who is not directly affected? Users on Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, OpenSUSE, RHEL, and their derivatives. None of these use the AUR. GitHub hosted CI runners on Ubuntu, Windows, or macOS images are safe. macOS users are not directly affected. But Homebrew has the same package ownership transfer model as the AUR. A maintainer abandons a formula, someone else can adopt it, and then modify the install script. The Atomic Arch campaign is a proof of concept for what a similar attack against Homebrew would look like. The malware targets GitHub tokens, SSH keys, cloud credentials, and Docker credentials. The blast radius of a compromised developer machine extends far beyond the machine itself. An attacker can pivot into GitHub organizations, cloud accounts, and internal systems that have nothing to do with Arch. This is not theoretical. Supply chain attacks against developer tooling have been used to breach major organizations. Sonatype's initial write-up counted 20 hijacked packages. Within a day, community trackers cataloged over 400. One master list compiled by grepping the AUR git mirror put the count at around 408. Sonatype tracks this as Sonatype 2026003775 with a CVSS score of 8.7. The affected list is still not considered complete and no CVE has been assigned. Stay vigilant. If you are an Arch user or you manage systems that run Arch, this section is the most operationally important part of this video. Let me give you the Sysadmin's incident response playbook. Step 1. Identify whether you are affected. Pull up your AUR package history. If you use yay, run yay-qm to list your foreign packages, the ones installed from the AUR. Cross-reference that list against the community-maintained affected package lists. The Arch mailing list thread and the CachyOS forums have the most up-to-date lists. You can also grab your package build cache and your pacnl log for the strings npm install atomic log file and bun install jsdigest. If either of those strings appears in a build log from June 11th onwards, treat that host as compromised. Step 2. If a flagged package ran, assume credential compromise. Do not try to determine exactly which credentials were accessed. Assume all of them were. Rotate your SSH keys. Revoke and regenerate your GitHub personal access tokens. Rotate your npm tokens. If you have HashiCorp Vault tokens, rotate them. Invalidate your browser sessions, log out of everything and log back in. Regenerate any Docker or Popnan credentials. If you have Cloud API keys stored on the machine, rotate those too. I know that sounds like a lot. It is. But the alternative is leaving an attacker with persistent access to your infrastructure. Step 3. Hunt for persistence. Check for unknown systemd services. Run system ctl-user list-units-type equals service and look for anything you do not recognize. Check the system level units too if the package ran as root. System ctl list-units-type equals service. Look for unexpected files under /var /lib / inspect /sys /fs /ppf / for the BPF maps named hidden pits. If those maps are present, the rootkit component is active. Step 4. If the package ran as root, do not try to clean the system. Rebuild it. I know that is a hard thing to hear, but there is no reliable way to verify a system is clean. The only trustworthy remediation is a fresh install from known good media, followed by reprovisioning with fresh credentials. Step 5. Going forward, read your PKG BUILDs. I know most people do not do this. I know it is tedious. But the AUR security model depends on users reading the build scripts before executing them. And be suspicious of any package that suddenly has new install hooks or new external dependencies after a period of dormancy. By the way, I just checked our channel analytics and it turns out about 90% of you watching right now are not subscribed yet. If you have been getting value from these Linux deep dives, hitting that subscribe button is the best free way to support the channel. Now, let me address the question that I suspect a lot of you are already thinking. Is this a reason to stop using the AUR entirely? And the honest answer is more nuanced than a simple yes or no. The AUR has always been a calculated risk. That is not a criticism, it is the design. The AUR's documentation explicitly states that AUR packages are user-produced content, that they are not vetted by Arch Linux, and that users install them at their own risk. The trust model is transparent. The problem is that the practical reality of how people use the AUR has drifted far from that intended model. Most Arch users run an AUR helper. Yay, Paru, Trizen, and they treat it like any other package manager. They run yay-su and accept updates without reviewing the PKG BUILDs. The helpers are designed to make the AUR feel seamless. And that seamlessness is exactly what this attack exploited. So, should you stop using the AUR? Here is my honest take as a sysadmin. For personal machines, where you are the only user and the only risk is to your own credentials, the AUR is still a reasonable choice, provided you adopt better habits. Read PKG BUILDs before building. Check the adoption history of packages you are about to install. Be particularly cautious about packages that were recently adopted or that have new install hooks. Use a sandbox build environment. There are tools like Orutils that let you build AUR packages in a clean chroot, which limits the blast radius of a malicious PKG BUILD. For work machines, developer workstations that have access to production infrastructure, CI runners, or any system where a credential compromise could have organizational consequences, I would not use the AUR, full stop. The risk to reward ratio does not make sense when the potential downside is a breach of your organization's GitHub organization, cloud environment, or internal infrastructure. This is not a new position. Security conscious organizations have always recommended against using the AUR on machines that handle sensitive credentials. The Atomic Arch campaign is just the most vivid illustration of why that recommendation exists. Now, what are the alternatives if you want the software selection of the AUR without the risk profile? Flatpak is the most obvious answer. Flatpak packages run in a sandbox environment. They cannot access your SSH keys, your shell history, or your system level credentials by default. The trade-off is that Flatpak applications are somewhat isolated from the rest of your system, which can cause friction for developer tools that need deep system integration. AppImage is another option for specific applications. App images are self-contained binaries that do not install anything, they just run. They cannot execute install hooks, because there is no install process. For packages that are generally not available anywhere else, consider building from source directly, using the PKG BUILD as a reference, but reviewing every line before you execute it. It is more work, but it is work you understand. The broader point is this. The AUR is a community resource, and the community's response to this attack has been impressive. Arch maintainers moved quickly to reset malicious commits and ban affected accounts. Community members built detection scripts and maintained affected package lists within hours. That is the open source ecosystem working as it should. But the structural vulnerability that made this attack possible, the ability to inherit trust through package adoption without additional scrutiny, is still there. The Atomic Arch campaign does not exist in isolation. It is part of a pattern that has been accelerating over the past several years. And understanding that pattern is important for anyone who works in IT or security. Supply chain attacks target the build and distribution infrastructure of software, rather than the software itself. Instead of finding a vulnerability in an application, attackers compromise the process by which that application is built or delivered. The result is that users receive software they trust from sources they trust that has been silently modified. The ex-Zeutils attack in 2024 is the most famous recent example. A sophisticated attacker spent nearly 2 years building a reputation as a legitimate contributor to the XZ project, before inserting a backdoor into the compression library that is used by OpenSSH on systemd-based Linux systems. That attack was caught by accident by a Microsoft engineer who noticed an unexpected performance regression. If it had shipped in a stable release, it would have given the attacker remote access to a significant fraction of internet-facing Linux servers. The Atomic Arch campaign is less sophisticated than XC in some ways. The attackers did not spend years building a reputation. They just adopted abandoned packages. But it is more scalable. They compromised over 400 packages simultaneously. Atomic Arch targeted hundreds of packages across the entire AUR ecosystem. What makes both attacks structurally similar is that they exploit trust. Not a software vulnerability, not a misconfiguration, trust. The trust that users place in package names, in version histories, in the apparent legitimacy of a maintainer account. That kind of trust is very hard to verify programmatically. The NPM ecosystem has seen dozens of similar attacks. PyPI has had similar incidents. GitHub Actions workflows have been compromised. The attack surface for supply chain attacks is enormous, and it is growing as software development becomes more dependent on third-party packages and automated build pipelines. For the Linux community specifically, there is a structural question here that does not have an easy answer. The AUR's openness is a feature, not a bug. The ability for any user to contribute packages, to adopt abandoned ones, to share build scripts for niche software, that is genuinely valuable. Restricting that openness would make the AUR less useful, but leaving it completely unrestricted means that the trust model will continue to be exploitable. Some proposals have been floated in the community. Mandatory PKG build review for recently adopted packages, or automated scanning of PKG builds for suspicious patterns. None of these are perfect solutions, but they would raise the cost of this kind of attack. A sophisticated attacker can work around any automated check. The Archinix team has not announced specific structural changes to the AUR as of the time I am recording this. What they have done is clean up the immediate damage and ban the affected accounts. Whether this incident leads to deeper changes to the AUR's trust model remains to be seen. I want to keep that question open for a moment, because the answer matters not just for Arch users, but for the entire open source ecosystem. I want to share a perspective that I think gets lost in the technical analysis of these attacks. Because after 25 years of managing systems in enterprise environments, I have seen this pattern play out in many different forms. The fundamental tension in open source security is not between open source and closed source. Closed source software has its own supply chain vulnerabilities. The SolarWinds attack compromised a proprietary build system and delivered malicious updates to 18,000 organizations. The tension is between the speed of open source contribution and the thoroughness of open source review. Open source moves fast because the barrier to contribution is low. That is a strength. It means bugs get fixed quickly and features get added. But that same low barrier means that the review process is often informal, trust-based, and dependent on community attention that is not always available. In enterprise environments, we deal with this by adding layers. We do not consume open source packages directly from upstream repositories. We mirror them internally. We scan them for known vulnerabilities, we pin versions, we review changes before they are deployed, we treat every third-party dependency as a potential risk factor. Most individual developers and home users do not have those layers. They install packages directly from the AUR or from NPM or from PyPI. They trust that the ecosystem's reputation is sufficient protection. For most packages, most of the time, that trust is justified. But when a trust model fails, it can fail catastrophically. I would recommend that you think about your personal security posture in the same way a security-conscious organization thinks about its software supply chain. What are your most sensitive credentials? Where are they stored? What software has access to them? And what would happen if a package you install tomorrow turned out to be malicious? For most people, the answer involves a lot of credentials that would need to be rotated. SSH keys that have been in place for years. GitHub tokens with access to multiple organizations. Browser sessions that are used for both personal and work accounts. The Atomic Arc attack is a useful prompt to audit that exposure, even if you are not an Arc user. There is also a practical argument for using a password manager and hardware security keys for your most sensitive accounts. If your GitHub account is protected by a FIDO2 hardware key, a stolen session token is much less useful to an attacker. If your SSH keys are stored on a hardware security key rather than on disk, the credential stealer cannot exfiltrate them. These are not exotic enterprise security measures. The Atomic Arch campaign is a reminder that security is not a product you install. It is a set of habits and practices that you maintain continuously. And the more valuable your credentials are, the more access they provide to production systems and organizational infrastructure, the more those habits matter. I want to address a question that has come up repeatedly in the community discussion around this attack. Would using Flatpak instead of the AUR have prevented this? The short answer is, for the specific packages involved, yes. But the longer answer is more nuanced, and it matters for how you think about your overall security posture. Flatpak applications run in a sandboxed environment. By default, a Flatpak application cannot read your SSH keys or your shell history. It cannot read your browser profile or your system level credentials. It has a restricted view of your file system. It cannot install systemd services or load eBPF programs. The credential stealer at the heart of the atomic architect requires access to all of those things. And Flatpak's sandbox would have denied that access. So if the packages that were compromised had been distributed as Flatpaks, the malicious build instructions would have been running in a limited context. They could not access the credentials they were trying to steal. The attack would have failed. But here is the important caveat. The AUR exists precisely because many of the packages it contains are not available as Flatpaks. The AUR's value proposition is access to niche tools, development utilities, and packages that require deep system integration. A lot of those packages are fundamentally incompatible with Flatpak's sandbox model. They need to access the file system, the network, and system services. A sandbox version of a package manager helper, for example, would not work at all. Flatpak also does not solve the supply chain problem entirely. A Flatpak application can still contain malicious code. It just cannot access system credentials by default. If a Flatpak application has been granted file system permissions, the sandbox is partially defeated. Many applications request these, and users often grant them without reading. And the Flatpak runtime itself is a dependency that needs to be trusted. AppImage has a different model. App images are self-contained binaries with no install process. There are no install hooks, no post-install scripts, and no PKG BUILD equivalent. An app image cannot inject code into your system during installation because there is no installation. The trade-off is that app images do not integrate with your system's package manager or receive automatic updates. They can also be large because they bundle their own dependencies. The honest answer is that there is no packaging format that is both maximally convenient and maximally secure. Every format makes trade-offs. The AUR trades security for flexibility. Flatpak trades flexibility for security. AppImage trades both for simplicity. What the atomic architect illustrates is that the trade-offs matter. Users should make them consciously rather than by default. If you are using the AUR because it is the path of least resistance on Arch, that is a legitimate choice. But you should understand what you're accepting in exchange for that convenience. The community response to this attack has been to push for better tooling around PKG BULD review and anomaly detection. That is the right direction. But until those tools exist and are widely adopted, the most reliable mitigation remains unchanged. Read what you are about to execute before you execute it. I want to give credit where it is due, because the Arch Linux community's response to this attack has been genuinely impressive, and it is instructive for how open source communities should handle security incidents. Within hours of the initial disclosure on June 11th, Arch maintainers were actively resetting malicious commits and banning the accounts that had been used to adopt the compromised packages. The Arch mailing list thread became a real-time coordination point for identifying affected packages and tracking the scope of the attack. Community members built detection scripts and shared them publicly. The CashUS forums, one of the first places to document the full scope, maintained a running list of compromised packages that was more comprehensive than any single official source. By June 14th, Arch Linux had stated that the malware incident was under control, with more than 1,500 affected packages identified, a number significantly higher than the initial 400 estimate, reflecting how thorough the community's audit had been. That speed matters. The faster a supply chain attack is detected and contained, the smaller the window in which users are exposed. The Atomic Arch campaign had a relatively short active window compared to something like the XZUtils attack, which went undetected for nearly 2 years. The open source community's ability to crowdsource detection and response is a genuine advantage over closed source ecosystems, where incident response is limited to a single vendor's security team. Sonatype, the security firm that named the campaign and did much of the initial technical analysis, published detailed indicators of compromise. The SHA-256 hash of the main payload, the Tor onion C2 address, the npm package names, the BPF map names. That kind of rapid, detailed public disclosure is exactly what the security community needs to respond effectively. It allowed other researchers to validate the analysis, build detection rules, and share them widely. The NPM registry also responded by removing the atomic log file and JS-digest packages after they were reported. That removes the delivery mechanism for new infections, though it does not help systems that were already compromised. What has not happened yet, as of the time I'm recording this, is a structural change to the AUR's trust model. The Arch team has not announced new requirements for package adoption, mandatory review periods, or automated PKG BYLD scanning. Those conversations are happening in the community, but they have not resulted in policy changes. This is where I have a mild criticism, not of the Arch team's response to the immediate incident, that was handled well, but of the broader pattern. This is not the first time the AUR has been used to distribute malware. There was a similar incident in 2018 involving an abandoned PDF viewer package. The 2026 version just scaled it up. If the same structural vulnerability is exploited again in 2028 or 2029, the community will have to ask whether the response to this incident was sufficient. The proposals that make the most sense to me, from a sysadmin's perspective, are a mandatory review period for packages that have recently changed maintainers, automated detection of new external network calls in PKG BUILDs, and a clearer warning in AUR helpers when a package has been recently adopted. None of these are perfect, but they would raise the cost of this attack pattern without fundamentally breaking the AUR's openness. The community has the technical capability to implement these measures. The question is whether this incident provides enough motivation to do so. Let me bring this together with the practical takeaways, because I want you to leave this video with a clear picture of what the Atomic Arch attack means for you specifically. If you are an Arch Linux user who uses the AUR, check your system now. Rang YM. Cross-reference against the affected package lists. Grab your build cache for atomic log file and JS-digest. And if you find a match, treat the host as credential compromised and follow the incident response steps I outlined earlier. Do not wait. The window for credential rotation is now, not after the attacker has had more time to use what they stole. If you are not an Arch user, this attack is still relevant to you, for two reasons. First, if you work with developers who use Arch on your team, in your organization, their compromised credentials could affect systems you are responsible for. Second, the attack pattern, adopting abandoned packages to inherit trust, is applicable to every open source package ecosystem. NPM, PYPI, Homebrew, GitHub Actions. The Atomic Arch campaign is a proof of concept for a class of attack that will be used again against other ecosystems with refinements. For everyone, this is a good moment to audit your credential hygiene. When did you last rotate your SSH keys? Are your GitHub tokens scoped to the minimum necessary permissions, or do they have full access? Are your most sensitive accounts protected by hardware security keys? These are not exotic enterprise security practices. They are accessible to individual developers, and they significantly reduce the impact of a credential theft attack. The AUR is not going away. Arch Linux is not going away. The open source supply chain is not going to become perfectly secure. What can change is how thoughtfully we engage with the trust model of the tools we use. Read your PKG BUILDs, check adoption histories, be suspicious of packages that suddenly have new external dependencies. And treat your developer credentials with the same care you would treat the keys to your house, because in a very real sense, that is what they are. The Atomic Arch campaign is a significant event, but it is also a solvable problem, and the community is already working on it. That is what open source does best. Like this video if it was useful, subscribe if you want to stay on top of Linux security and the stories that actually matter for the people who run and administer Linux systems. And sign up for the weekly newsletter at tonduslinux.com/newsletter. It is the best way to get a curated summary of everything that matters in the Linux world directly in your inbox. And if you want to support the channel directly and get some cool perks, consider clicking the join button below to become a sudo user or get root access. It makes a real difference to what we can produce here.